Les Misérables.
Volume 2. Cosette. Book 2nd. The Ship Orion. By Victor Hugo. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. Chapter 1. Number 24601 becomes number 9430. Jean Valjean had been recaptured. The reader will be grateful to us if we pass rapidly over the sad details. We will confine ourselves to transcribing 2 paragraphs published by the journals of that day, a few months after the surprising events which had taken place at M-sur-M. These articles are rather summary. It must be remembered that at that epoch the Gazette des Tribunaux was not yet in existence. We borrow the first from the Drapeau Blanc. It bears the date of July 25th, 1823. An arrondissement of the Pas-de-Calais has just been the theatre of an event quite out of the ordinary course. A man who was a stranger in the department and who bore the name of Monsieur Madeleine had, thanks to the new methods, resuscitated some years ago an ancient local industry, the manufacture of jet and of black glass trinkets. He had made his fortune in the business, and that of the arrondissement as well, we will admit. He had been appointed mayor in recognition of his services. The police discovered that Monsieur Madeleine was no other than an ex-convict who had broken his ban, condemned in 1796 for theft, and named Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean has been recommitted to prison. It appears that previous to his arrest, he had succeeded in withdrawing from the hands of Monsieur Laffitte a sum of over 500,000 which he had lodged there, and which he had, moreover, and by perfectly legitimate means, acquired in his business. No one has been able to discover where Jean Valjean has concealed this money since his return to prison at Toulon. The second article, which enters a little more into detail, is an extract from the Journal de Paris of the same date. A former convict who had been liberated, named Jean Valjean, has just appeared before the Court of Assizes of the Var under circumstances calculated to attract attention. This wretch had succeeded in escaping the vigilance of the police. He had changed his name and had succeeded in getting himself appointed mayor of one of our small northern towns. In this town he had established a considerable commerce. He has at last been unmasked and arrested, thanks to the indefatigable zeal of the public prosecutor. He had for his concubine a woman of the town, who died of a shock at the moment of his arrest. This scoundrel, who is endowed with Herculean strength, found means to escape, but 3 or 4 days after his flight the police laid their hands on him once more, in Paris itself, at the very moment when he was entering one of those little vehicles which run between the capital and the village of Montfermeil, Seine-et-Oise. He is said to have profited by this interval of 3 or 4 days of liberty to withdraw a considerable sum deposited by him with one of our leading bankers. This sum has been estimated at 600,000 or 700,000 francs. If the indictment is to be trusted, he has hidden it in some place known to himself alone, and it has not been possible to lay hands on it. However that may be, the said Jean Valjean has just been brought before the Assizes of the Department of the Var as accused of highway robbery accompanied with violence, about 8 years ago, on the person of one of those honest children who, as the Patriarch of Ferney has said in immortal verse, arrive from Savoy every year, and who with gentle hands do clear those long canals choked up with soot. This bandit refused to defend himself. It was proved by the skilful and eloquent representative of the public prosecutor that the theft was committed in complicity with others, and that Jean Valjean was a member of a band of robbers in the south. Jean Valjean was pronounced guilty and was condemned to the death penalty in consequence. This criminal refused to lodge an appeal. The king, in his inexhaustible clemency, has deigned to commute his penalty to that of penal servitude for life. Jean Valjean was immediately taken to the prison at Toulon. The reader has not forgotten that Jean Valjean had religious habits at M. Some papers, among others the Constitutional, presented this commutation as a triumph of the priestly party. Jean Valjean changed his number in the galleys. He was called 9430. However, and we will mention it at once in order that we may not be obliged to recur to the subject, the prosperity of M. vanished with M. Madeleine. All that he had foreseen during his night of fever and hesitation was realized. Lacking him, there actually was a soul lacking. After this fall, there took place at M. that egotistical division of great existences which have fallen, that fatal dismemberment of flourishing things which is accomplished every day obscurely in the human community, and which history has noted only once because it occurred after the death of Alexander. Lieutenants are crowned kings, superintendents improvise manufacturers out of themselves. Envious rivalries arose. M. Madeleine's vast workshops were shut, his buildings fell to ruin, his workmen were scattered. Some of them quitted the country, others abandoned the trade. Thenceforth, everything was done on a small scale instead of on a grand scale, for lucre instead of the general good. There was no longer a centre, everywhere there was competition and animosity. M. Madeleine had reigned over all and directed it all. No sooner had he fallen than each pulled things to himself. The spirit of combat succeeded to the spirit of organization, bitterness to cordiality, hatred of one another to the benevolence of the founder towards all. The threads which M. Madeleine had set were tangled and broken. The methods were adulterated, the products were debased. Confidence was killed, the market diminished. For lack of orders, salaries were reduced, the workshops stood still, bankruptcy arrived. And then there was nothing more for the poor. All had vanished. The state itself perceived that someone had been crushed somewhere. Less than 4 years after the judgment of the Court of Assizes, establishing the identity of Jean Valjean and M. Madeleine for the benefit of the galleys, the costs of collecting taxes had doubled in the arrondissement of M. and M. de Villèle called attention to the fact in the rostrum in the month of February 1827. Chapter 2, in which the reader will peruse 2 verses which are of the devil's composition, possibly. Before proceeding further, it will be to the purpose to narrate in some detail a singular occurrence which took place at about the same epoch in Montfermeil, and which is not lacking in coincidence with certain conjectures of the indictment. There exists in the region of Montfermeil a very ancient superstition, which is all the more curious and all the more precious, because a popular superstition in the vicinity of Paris is like an aloe in Siberia. We are among those who respect everything which is in the nature of a rare plant. Here, then, is the superstition of Montfermeil. It is thought that the devil, from time immemorial, has selected the forest as a hiding place for his treasures. Good wives affirm that it is no rarity to encounter at nightfall, in secluded nooks of the forest, a black man with the air of a carter or a wood chopper, wearing wooden shoes, clad in trousers and a blouse of linen, and recognizable by the fact that, instead of a cap or hat, he has 2 immense horns on his head. This ought, in fact, to render him recognizable. This man is habitually engaged in digging a hole. There are 3 ways of profiting by such an encounter. The first is to approach the man and speak to him. Then it is seen that the man is simply a peasant, that he appears black because it is nightfall, that he is not digging any hole whatever, but is cutting grass for his cows, and that what had been taken for horns is nothing but a dung fork which he is carrying on his back, and whose teeth, thanks to the perspective of evening, seem to spring from his head. The man returns home and dies within the week. The second way is to watch, to wait until he has dug his hole, until he has filled it and has gone away, then to run with great speed to the trench, to open it once more and to seize the treasure, which the black man has necessarily placed there. In this case, one dies within the month. Finally, the last method is not to speak to the black man, not to look at him, and to flee at the best speed of one's legs. One then dies within the year. As all three methods are attended with their special inconveniences, the second, which at all events presents some advantages, among others that of possessing a treasure, if only for a month, is the one most generally adopted. So bold men who are tempted by every chance have quite frequently, as we are assured, opened the holes excavated by the black man and tried to rob the devil. The success of the operation appears to be but moderate. At least, if the tradition is to be believed, and in particular the two enigmatical lines in barbarous Latin which an evil Norman monk, a bit of a sorcerer named Tryphon, has left on this subject. This Tryphon is buried at the Abbey of St. Georges de Bocherville, near Rouen, and toads spawn on his grave. Accordingly, enormous efforts are made. Such trenches are ordinarily extremely deep. A man sweats, digs, toils all night, for it must be done at night. He wets his shirt, burns out his candle, breaks his mattock, and when he arrives at the bottom of the hole, when he lays his hand on the treasure, what does he find? What is the devil's treasure? A sou, sometimes a crown piece, a stone, a skeleton, a bleeding body, sometimes a spectre folded in four like a sheet of paper in a portfolio, sometimes nothing. This is what Tryphon's verses seem to announce to the indiscreet and curious. Fodit, et in fossa thesaurus condit opaca, as numas lepidis cadaver simulcra nilci. It seems that in our day there is sometimes found a powder horn with bullets, sometimes an old pack of cards, greasy and worn, which has evidently served the devil. Tryphon does not record these two finds, since Tryphon lived in the 12th century, and since the devil does not appear to have had the wit to invent powder before Roger Bacon's time, and cards before the time of Charles VI. Moreover, if one plays at cards, one is sure to lose all that one possesses, and for the powder in the horn it possesses the property of making your gun burst in your face. Now, a very short time after the epoch when it seemed to the prosecuting attorney that the liberated convict Jean Valjean, during his flight of several days, had been prowling around Montfermeil, it was remarked in that village that a certain old road labourer, named Boulatruelle, had peculiar ways in the forest. People thereabouts thought they knew that this Boulatruelle had been in the galleys. He was subjected to certain police supervision, and, as he could find work nowhere, the administration employed him at reduced rates as a road mender on the crossroad from Gagny to Lagny. This Boulatruelle was a man who was viewed with disfavour by the inhabitants of the district as too respectful, too humble, too prompt in removing his cap to everyone, and trembling and smiling in the presence of the gendarmes. Probably affiliated to robber bands, they said, suspected of lying in ambush at verge of copses at nightfall. The only thing in his favour was that he was a drunkard. This is what people thought they had noticed. Of late, Boulatruelle had taken to quitting his task of stone-breaking and care of the road at a very early hour, and to betaking himself to the forest with his pickaxe. He was encountered towards evening in the most deserted clearings, in the wildest thickets, and he had the appearance of being in search of something, and sometimes he was digging holes. The good wives who passed took him at first for Beelzebub. They then recognized Boulatruelle, and were not in the least reassured thereby. These encounters seemed to cause Boulatruelle a lively displeasure. It was evident that he sought to hide, and that there was some mystery in what he was doing. It was said in the village, "It is clear that the devil has appeared. Boulatruelle has seen him, and is on the search. In sooth, he is cunning enough to pocket Lucifer's hoard." The Voltairians added, "Will Boulatruelle catch the devil, or will the devil catch Boulatruelle?" The old women made a great many signs of the cross. In the meantime, Boulatruelle's manoeuvres in the forest ceased, and he resumed his regular occupation of road mending, and people gossiped of something else. Some persons, however, were still curious, surmising that in all this there was probably no fabulous treasure of the legend, but some fine windfall of a more serious and palpable sort than the devil's bank bills, and that the road mender had half discovered the secret. The most puzzled were the schoolmaster and Thénardier, the proprietor of the tavern, who was everybody's friend and had not disdained to ally himself with Boulatruelle. "He has been in the galleys," said Thénardier. "Eh? Good God, no one knows who has been there or will be there." One evening the schoolmaster affirmed that in former times the law would have instituted an inquiry as to what Boulatruelle did in the forest, and that the latter would have been forced to speak, and that he would have been put to the torture in case of need, and that Boulatruelle would not have resisted the water test, for example. "Let us put him to the wine test," said Thénardier. They made an effort and got the old road mender to drinking. Boulatruelle drank an enormous amount, but said very little. He combined with admirable art and, in masterly proportions, the thirst of a gourmandizer with the discretion of a judge. Nevertheless, by dint of returning to the charge and of comparing and putting together the few obscure words which he did not allow to escape him, this is what Thénardier and the schoolmaster imagined that they had made out. One morning, when Boulatruelle was on his way to his work, at daybreak, he had been surprised to see, at a nook of the forest in the underbush, a shovel and a pickaxe concealed, as one might say. However, he might have supposed that they were probably the shovel and pick of Father Sixfours, the water-carrier, and would have thought no more about it. But on the evening of that day he saw, without being seen himself, as he was hidden by a large tree, a person who did not belong in those parts, and whom he, Boulatruelle, knew well, directing his footsteps towards the densest part of the wood. Translation by Thénardier. A comrade of the galleys, Boulatruelle obstinately refused to reveal his name. This person carried a package, something square, like a large box or a small trunk. Surprise on the part of Boulatruelle. However, it was only after the expiration of 7 or 8 minutes that the idea of following that person had occurred to him. But it was too late. The person was already in the thicket. Night had descended, and Boulatruelle had not been able to catch up with him. Then he had adopted the course of watching for him at the edge of the woods. It was moonlight. 2 or 3 hours later, Boulatruelle had seen this person emerge from the brushwood, carrying no longer the coffer, but a shovel and pick. Boulatruelle had allowed the person to pass, and had not dreamed of accosting him, because he said to himself that the other man was 3 times as strong as he was, and armed with a pickaxe, and that he would probably knock him over the head on recognizing him, and on perceiving that he was recognized. Touching effusion of 2 old comrades on meeting again. But the shovel and pick had served as a ray of light to Boulatruelle. He had hastened to the thicket in the morning, and had found neither shovel nor pick. From this he had drawn the inference that this person, once in the forest, had dug a hole with his pick, buried the coffer, and reclosed the hole with his shovel. Now the coffer was too small to contain a body, therefore it contained money. Hence his researches. Boulatruelle had explored, sounded, searched the entire forest and the thicket, and had dug wherever the earth appeared to him to have been recently turned up. In vain. He had ferreted out nothing. No one in Montfermeil thought any more about it. There were only a few brave gossips who said, "You may be certain that the mender on the Gagny road did not take all that trouble for nothing. He was sure that the devil had come." Chapter 3. The ankle chain must have undergone a certain preparatory manipulation to be thus broken with a blow from a hammer. Towards the end of October in the same year, 1823, the inhabitants of Toulon beheld the entry into their port, after heavy weather, and for the purpose of repairing some damages, of the ship Orion, which was employed later at Brest as a school ship, and which then formed a part of the Mediterranean squadron. This vessel, battered as it was, for the sea had handled it roughly, produced a fine effect as it entered the roads. It flew some colours which procured for it the regulation salute of 11 guns, which it returned shot for shot. Total 22. It had been calculated that what with salvos, royal and military politenesses, courteous exchanges of uproar, signals of etiquette, formalities of roadsteads and citadels, sunrises and sunsets, saluted every day by all fortresses and all ships of war, openings and closings of ports, etc., the civilized world discharged all over the earth, in the course of 24 hours, 150,000 useless shots. At 6 francs the shot, that comes to 900,000 francs a day, 300 millions a year, which vanish in smoke. This is a mere detail. All this time the poor were dying of hunger. The year 1823 was what the Restoration called the epoch of the Spanish War. This war contained many events in one and a quantity of peculiarities. A grand family affair for the House of Bourbon, the branch of France succouring and protecting the branch of Madrid, that is to say, performing an act devolving on the elder. An apparent return to our national traditions, complicated by servitude and by subjection to the cabinets of the North. Monsieur le Duc de d'Angoulême, surnamed by the liberal sheets the hero of Andujar, compressing in a triumphal attitude that was somewhat contradicted by his peaceable air and ancient and very powerful terrorism of the Holy Office, at variance with the chimerical terrorism of the Liberals, the sans-culottes resuscitated, to the great terror of dowagers, under the name of descamisados, monarchy opposing an obstacle to progress described as anarchy, the theories of 89 roughly interrupted in the sap, a European halt called to the French idea, which was making the tour of the world. Beside the son of France as Generalissimo, the Prince de Carillon, afterwards Charles Albert, enrolling himself in that crusade of kings against people as a volunteer, with grenadier epaulettes of red worsted, the soldiers of the Empire setting out on a fresh campaign, but aged, saddened after 8 years of repose, and under the white cockade. The tricoloured standard waved abroad by a heroic handful of Frenchmen, as the white standard had been 30 years earlier at Coblentz. Monks mingled with our troops, the spirit of liberty and of novelty brought to its senses by bayonets, principles slaughtered by cannonades, France undoing by her arms that which she had done by her mind. In addition to this, hostile leaders sold, soldiers hesitating, cities besieged by millions, no military perils, and yet possible explosions, as in every mine which is surprised and invaded. But little bloodshed, little honour won, shame for some, glory for no one. Such was this war, made by the princes descended from Louis XIV, and conducted by generals who had been under Napoleon. Its sad fate was to recall neither the grand war nor grand politics. Some feats of arms were serious. The taking of the Trocadero, among others, was a fine military action, but after all, we repeat, the trumpets of this war give back a cracked sound. The whole effect was suspicious. History approves of France for making a difficulty about accepting this false triumph. It seemed evident that certain Spanish officers charged with resistance yielded too easily. The idea of corruption was connected with the victory. It appears as though generals and not battles had been won, and the conquering soldier returned humiliated. A debasing war, in short, in which the Bank of France could be read in the folds of the flag. Soldiers of the War of 1808, on whom Saragossa had fallen in formidable ruin, frowned in 1823 at the easy surrender of citadels and began to regret Palafox. It is the nature of France to prefer to have Rostov-Chine rather than Ballesteros in front of her. From a still more serious point of view, and one which it is also proper to insist upon here, this war, which wounded the military spirit of France, enraged the democratic spirit. It was an enterprise of enthralment. In that campaign, the object of the French soldier, the son of democracy, was the conquest of a yoke for others. A hideous contradiction. France is made to arouse the soul of nations, not to stifle it. All the revolutions of Europe since 1792 are the French Revolution. Liberty darts rays from France. That is a solar fact. Blind is he who will not see. It was Bonaparte who said it. The War of 1823, an outrage on the generous Spanish nation, was then, at the same time, an outrage on the French Revolution. It was France who committed this monstrous violence by foul means, for, with the exception of wars of liberation, everything that armies do is by foul means. The words passive obedience indicate this. An army is a strange masterpiece of combination where force results from an enormous sum of impotence. Thus is war made by humanity against humanity, despite humanity explained. As for the Bourbons, the War of 1823 was fatal to them. They took it for a success. They did not perceive the danger that lies in having an idea slain to order. They went astray in their innocence to such a degree that they introduced the immense enfeeblement of a crime into their establishment as an element of strength. The spirit of the ambush entered into their politics. 1830 had its germ in 1823. The Spanish campaign became in their councils an argument for force and for adventures by right divine. France, having re-established El Rey Neto in Spain, might well have re-established the absolute king at home. They fell into the alarming error of taking the obedience of the soldier for the consent of the nation. Such confidence is the ruin of thrones. It is not permitted to fall asleep either in the shadow of a machineal tree nor in the shadow of an army. Let us return to the ship Orion. During the operations of the army commanded by the Prince Generalissimo, a squadron had been cruising in the Mediterranean. We have just stated that the Orion belonged to this fleet, and that accidents of the sea had brought it into port at Toulon. The presence of a vessel of war in a port has something about it which attracts and engages a crowd. It is because it is great, and the crowd loves what is great. A ship of the line is one of the most magnificent combinations of the genius of man with the powers of nature. A ship of the line is composed at the same time of the heaviest and the lightest of possible matter, for it deals at one and the same time with three forms of substance: solid, liquid, and fluid, and it must do battle with all three. It has 11 claws of iron with which to seize the granite on the bottom of the sea, and more wings and more antennae than winged insects, to catch the wind in the clouds. Its breath pours out through its 120 cannons as through enormous trumpets, and replies proudly to the thunder. The ocean seeks to lead it astray in the alarming sameness of its billows, but the vessel has its soul, its compass, which counsels it and always shows it the north. In the blackest nights its lanterns supply the place of the stars. Thus, against the wind, it has its cordage and its canvas; against the water, wood; against the rocks, its iron, brass, and lead; against the shadows, its light; against immensity, a needle. If one wishes to form an idea of all those gigantic proportions which, taken as a whole, constitute the ship of the line, one has only to enter one of the 6-story covered construction stocks in the ports of Brest or Toulon. The vessels in process of construction are under a bell glass there, as it were. The colossal beam is a yard. That great column of wood which stretches out on the earth as far as the eye can reach is the main mast. Taking it from its root in the stocks to its tip in the clouds, it is 60 fathoms long, and its diameter at its base is 3 feet. The English mainmast rises to a height of 217 feet above the waterline. The navy of our fathers employed cables, ours employed chains. The simple pile of chains on a ship of 100 guns is 4 feet high, 20 feet in breadth, and 8 feet in depth. And how much wood is required to make this ship? 3,000 cubic meters. It is a floating forest. And moreover, let this be borne in mind, it is only a question here of the military vessel of 40 years ago, of the simple sailing vessel. Steam, then, in its infancy, has since added new miracles to that prodigy which is called a war vessel. At the present time, for example, the mixed vessel with a screw is a surprising machine, propelled by 3,000 square meters of canvas and by an engine of 2,500 horsepower. Not to mention these new marvels, the ancient vessel of Christopher Columbus and of de Ruyter is one of the masterpieces of man. It is as inexhaustible in force as is the infinite in gales. It stores up the wind in its sails. It is precise in the immense vagueness of the billows. It floats and it rains. There comes an hour, nevertheless, when the gale breaks that 60-foot yard like a straw, when the wind bends that mast 400 feet tall, when that anchor, which weighs tens of thousands, is twisted in the jaws of the waves like a fisherman's hook in the jaws of a pike, when those monstrous cannons utter plaintive and futile roars, which the hurricane bears forth into the void and into the night, when all that power and all that majesty are engulfed in a power and majesty which are superior. Every time that immense force is displayed to culminate in an immense feebleness, it affords men food for thought. Hence, in the ports, curious people abound around these marvellous machines of war and of navigation, without being able to explain perfectly to themselves why. Every day, accordingly, from morning until night, the quays, sluices, and the jetties of the port of Toulon were covered with a multitude of idlers and loungers, as they say in Paris, whose business consisted in staring at the Orion. The Orion was a ship that had been ailing for a long time. In the course of its previous cruises, thick layers of barnacles had collected on its keel to such a degree as to deprive it of half its speed. It had gone into the dry dock the year before this, in order to have the barnacles scraped off. Then it had put to sea again, but this cleaning had affected the bolts of the keel. In the neighbourhood of the Balearic Isles, the sides had been strained and had opened, and, as the plating in those days was not of sheet iron, the vessel had sprung a leak. A violent equinoctial gale had come up, which had first staved in a grating and a porthole on the larboard side, and damaged the foretop-gallant shrouds. In consequence of these injuries, the Orion had run back to Toulon. It had anchored near the arsenal. It was fully equipped, and repairs were begun. The hull had received no damage on the starboard, but some of the planks had been unnailed here and there, according to custom, to permit of air entering the hold. One morning the crowd which was gazing at it witnessed an accident. The crew was busy bending the sails. The topman, who had to take the upper corner of the main topsail on the starboard, lost his balance. He was seen to waver. The multitude thronging the arsenal quay uttered a cry. The man's head overbalanced his body. The man fell around the yard, with his hands outstretched towards the abyss. On his way he seized the foot-rope, first with one hand, then with the other, and remained hanging from it. The sea lay below him at a dizzy depth. The shock of his fall had imparted to the foot-rope a violent swinging motion. The man swayed back and forth at the end of that rope, like a stone in a sling. It was incurring a frightful risk to go to his assistance. Not one of the sailors, all fishermen of the coast recently levied for the service, dared to attempt it. In the meantime, the unfortunate topman was losing his strength. His anguish could not be discerned on his face, but his exhaustion was visible in every limb. His arms were contracted in horrible twitchings. Every effort which he made to reascend served but to augment the oscillations of the foot-rope. He did not shout, for fear of exhausting his strength. All were awaiting the minute when he should release his hold on the rope, and, from instant to instant, heads were turned aside that his fall might not be seen. There are moments when a bit of rope, a pole, the branch of a tree, is life itself, and it is a terrible thing to see a living being detach himself from it and fall like a ripe fruit. All at once a man was seen climbing into the rigging with the agility of a tiger cat. This man was dressed in red. He was a convict. He wore a green cap. He was a life convict. On arriving on a level with the top, a gust of wind carried away his cap and allowed a perfectly white head to be seen. He was not a young man. A convict employed on board with a detachment from the galleys had, in fact, at the very first instant, hastened to the officer of the watch, and, in the midst of the consternation and the hesitation of the crew, while all the sailors were trembling and drawing back, he had asked the officer's permission to risk his life to save the topman. At an affirmative sign from the officer, he had broken the chain riveted to his ankle with one blow of a hammer. Then he had caught up a rope and had dashed into the rigging. No one noticed at the instant with what ease that chain had been broken. It was only later on that the incident was recalled. In a twinkling, he was on the yard. He paused for a few seconds and appeared to be measuring it with his eye. These seconds, during which the breeze swayed the topman at the extremity of a thread, seemed centuries to those who were looking on. At last, the convict raised his eyes to heaven and advanced a step. The crowd drew a long breath. He was seen to run out along the yard. On arriving at the point, he fastened the rope which he had brought to it and allowed the other end to hang down, and then he began to descend the rope, hand over hand, and then, and the anguish was indescribable, instead of one man suspended over the gulf, there were two. One would have said it was a spider coming to seize a fly, only here the spider brought life, not death. 10,000 glances were fastened on this group, not a cry, not a word. The same tremor contracted every brow. All mouths held their breath as they feared to add the slightest puff to the wind which was swaying the two unfortunate men. In the meantime, the convict had succeeded in lowering himself to a position near the sailor. It was high time, 1 minute more, and the exhausted and despairing man would have allowed himself to fall into the abyss. The convict had moored him securely with a cord, to which he clung with one hand while he was working with the other. At last he was seen to climb back on the yard and to drag the sailor up after him. He held him there a moment to allow him to recover his strength. Then he grasped him in his arms and carried him, walking on the yard himself to the cap, and from there to the main top, where he left him in the hands of his comrades. At that moment the crowd broke into applause. Old convict sergeants among them wept, and women embraced each other on the quay, and all voices were heard to cry with a sort of tender rage, "Pardon for that man!" He, in the meantime, had immediately begun to make his descent to rejoin his detachment. In order to reach them the more speedily, he dropped into the rigging and ran along one of the lower yards. All eyes were following him. At a certain moment fear assailed them. Whether it was that he was fatigued or that his head turned, they thought they saw him hesitate and stagger. All at once the crowd uttered a loud shout. The convict had fallen into the sea. The fall was perilous. The frigate Algeciras was anchored alongside the Orion, and the poor convict had fallen between the two vessels. It was to be feared that he would slip under one or the other of them. 4 men flung themselves hastily into a boat. The crowd cheered them on. Anxiety again took possession of all souls. The man had not risen to the surface. He had disappeared in the sea without leaving a ripple, as though he had fallen into a cask of oil. They sounded, they dived. In vain. The search was continued until the evening. They did not even find the body. On the following day, the Toulon newspaper printed these lines. November 17, 1823. Yesterday, a convict belonging to the detachment on board of the Orion, on his return from rendering assistance to a sailor, fell into the sea and was drowned. The body has not yet been found. It is supposed that it is entangled among the piles of the Arsenal Point. This man was committed under the number 9430, and his name was Jean Valjean.